Welcome back, listeners. It is my honor to introduce you to Lenore Rattray. Now, Lenore is the head of a podcast called Stand Up 8, and its first season started in March of 23. Now, at the age of 21, Lenore, in the summer of 1992, was the survivor of a robbery, a 9-day kidnapping, and assault. And her podcast is her storytelling from the survivor's perspective of a true crime that occurred in Canada. This was fascinating, Lenore, to listen to. I listened to your first episode. I jumped around, listened to a later episode about storytelling and the impact of storytelling. And we don't have to dive straight into that piece yet, because I know that comes a little bit later in the story. But your overall purpose, I think, is such a fresh take on true crime and wanting to tell the perspective from the survivor versus the fascination that comes with true crime of, I loved what you called the fascinating monster, referring to the perpetrator, and how, so much of the time media and even the consumers of this kind of genre really love to dig into and pick at the motivations and the why and how could they have done this? What were they thinking? Oh, and here's where they almost got caught. But you flip it on its head and you have so much rich detail in your storytelling, and you're telling it from your own perspective. And it was so engaging. So I'm really curious what it was that pushed you to tell this story.
Wow, that's a very kindly then. What pushed me? Well, there was a lot of layers in it. And I think the main driving force behind the push was my health. It came pretty apparent through a major health crisis, for lack of a more simpler way of putting it, that I was mentally and physically getting very ill, and there was a lot of challenge to find out why that was. And it was only through the amazing work of a psychologist that I was essentially forced to see, because my health was affecting my work. But I saw a psychologist back in 2015, I guess, most. We started to click in 2015, and through the first couple of sessions, she presented to me the idea that I think you have PTSD. And I laughed. And much like the results of the many other medical professionals I was seeing that couldn't give me explanations as to why I was having stroke symptoms, cancer symptoms, heart attack symptoms. And this was another one. And the first thing I said back to her was, I haven't been in a war. And that really opened it up. And it wasn't necessarily overnight, but she educated me on really what PTSD is and the long-term pervasive impact it can have, the compounded effect. And it was through writing as a therapeutic tool that I realized that by not telling my story, I was getting very much sicker. And I really started to see and understand the connection between your mental health and your physical health. So that's really where it started.
That's such a relatable starting point. That's something I've reflected on. That's something that I've talked to other guests who have written memoir, or the one I recorded with recently, which will be a week or two before this episode. If you guys want to go back and look at that one, about someone who wrote memoir and then ended up using it in the form of poetry instead. She also highlighted the physicality of the health, not even just the mental health. So much of that we brush aside when it starts to, take a downhill slope, but then it's like starts to manifest itself in these physical ailments,
Mhm.
whether that's, the sleep or for you, like very significant things like you were saying, like the cancer, stroke kind of symptoms and uh, confusion about what could be causing that, and it's wild and fascinating and also just really cool the way that our stories just have to be told, right? Like they will continue to nag at us until we're ready to tell them in whatever capacity that looks like. Like you had mentioned, simply using writing as a form of therapy, which I assume, at least in the beginning, was purely for your own or between you and your, psychiatrist or psychologist, like that was just for you at that point.
Yeah.
But even that starts to alleviate some of the symptoms and allows for that healing and that growth and that understanding, right?
It does. Yeah, it was, and like, I can't emphasize enough that it wasn't overnight because, I mean, this was years, and it wasn't, uh I can't say that everything bad in my health and my mental and physical health is related to that crime that I survived, uh, but it certainly leaves a pretty heavy mark. And then when you have other traumas of life that either lay below it or go on top of it, the compounded effect on our systems, that was a revelation to me because most of us have this drive to keep going, moving forward, and that's what I was trying to do. But even though I wasn't necessarily hiding the story, I would tell anyone who wanted to talk about it. I use it as part of my career path, but I wasn't I just wasn't owning its true impact on me, if that makes any sense. And then the other part in that, to answer your question before, what motivated me to write this? Well, this breakdown of my health also coincided with my experience as a first-time mother. And if you've ever had a child, it does change your mindset. Any types of vulnerability brick walls you've built, it, it
Mhm.
it takes a good chunk of them, if not destroying them altogether. And that really, especially having a daughter around the time that she was 2.5 years old, I can see in hindsight how motherhood tried to destroy me, and it was connected to this mental package that I hadn't properly dealt with. So, yeah.
It's interesting you bring up motherhood. I remember taking one of those like personality tests back when I was still in my forensic science career, and a coworker was really confused, and she said she was talking to the lead person, was like, I've taken this 3 times now, and it says I'm a new personality type than what I was before, and the leader was like, "Oh, yeah, that can happen if you experienced trauma, such as motherhood." And, like, listed that as one of the, like, key traumas that could result in a total, like, personality switch according to the, Myers-Briggs testing. Like,
Wow.
they've seen that, like, it's something that can happen, and so, as much as it's sort of like an anecdotal, like, "Oh, yeah, motherhood changed me," kind of thing, like, it literally does and
Yes.
can and
Yeah.
will.
And we don't talk about these things, and there's no fault of anyone's. It's we're all unique. We're all different. We all have these depending on what's going on in our life, the impact of what has happened will be different. Uh,
Mm.
but I think as we talked about earlier before we were recording, we all we're more alike than we realize. And I think that's why the power of telling our stories, no matter the details of the trauma or the hardship that we went through. It's the process of overcoming and the feelings and the coping mechanisms that are very relatable. And that's, I think, knowing that we're not alone in those. That's how we get through. And I think that's what's really powerful about memoir.
For sure. I was listening to, the first episode earlier and, you talk about that whole like time in your life, right? You had just moved. So you'd left your home and you're like being an adult, right? And you're talking about that like ennui of being in that job, the boredom of like sitting at the desk and cleaning this counter that you just cleaned yesterday. It like so put me in that place. It was so relatable to like that same kind of like early jobs that feel really kind of meaningless. You're just trying to get your foot in the door somewhere. You're making the copies, you're making the coffee, going through the motions, right? Like
Yeah.
you just captured that. That was so relatable. Even though I can't relate to the robbery, the kidnapping, all those other pieces, like at least not in there like the exact way, but you captured that sort of quintessential like early adult, like, is this really what my life is gonna be like? Kind of sense of wow, this is so boring.
Yeah, it was. Well, and it was a shock in so many ways. And comparing the cities, Calgary to Vancouver in those days, and even now, Vancouver is a much bigger city, and the level of homelessness and crime and addiction and poverty, and it really slaps you in the face. So that certainly added to it all as a 21-year-old, stuck in a land where everybody speaks my language. But yeah, it was very different. But you made me think of something when you were talking about the relatable side of things. It was one particular memoir mm, that really made me realize how I want to write and what I want to write. And it was um, Tara Westover's Educated. And
Oh, yes.
even
Mhm.
though, and I think that was in 2018, 2017, 2018 when that came out. And I've
Mhm.
read that book probably at least 3 times since. And every time it lands with me very different, but still very powerful. And it's not because her story, I have not, my life has nothing to do with being a Mormon survivalist. And what she went through, the details, very, very different to anything I can relate to. But the way she talks about the impact and the coping, and the way she also just makes the reader think. She never labels the religion. You never walk away thinking, in my opinion anyway, that that religion is bad or something, or her father is bad or her brother was bad. You can just, I just tapped into the vein of the messaging behind it. And it was being your own person and overcoming and finding your way. And I think that's the power in a good story told in a way that really allows the reader to find their own journey. Because I mean, that's the point, and that's the point behind doing the podcast. It was my writer mentor, who is a lead mentor at one of our major universities here, Simon Fraser University. He also has a background in having a radio show with our major broadcasting agency, the CBC. So his ear is on both sides, and when he heard me telling my story, he felt that as someone who aspires to write a book, as we know, writing a book isn't the most simplest and efficient of tasks. He said, let's record it, and let's basically create your book in 8 episodes, and let's look at more the core elements that kept you alive, as opposed to just telling the crime story,
Mhm.
which would take us away from leaning towards the bad guy and what's perceived as the power in what he did. Let's look at the power of the person that survived, and look at those common veins of survival mechanisms that we all have in us, and we all we all need to pull out sometimes. The compliance, the
Yeah,
adaptability, the shutting down. Like, can those all be? Can we look at those in a way that isn't necessarily a negative, and how it helps us to keep moving forward? So,
absolutely. I want to talk to you a little bit about your writing process because I was very impressed with the level of detail, how descriptive you were. And I know that trauma can really have you know, polarizing impacts. Either, our brains try to protect us and we remember nothing of it, of what happens, none of the details, or like we're on hyper alert, hyper vigilant, all of our senses are turned on and we remember everything. And it certainly seems, as you indicated, at least in your early episodes, that was kind of the impact it had on you, that you just remembered, you could recall so much of the conversation and just what was happening even before your body knew that that would be something significant. It was still registering, at least on some level, that it was
mm.
out of the ordinary, at least I would say. Um, and so I'm curious what that was like with your writing process. Did that detail come back easily for you? And I say easily, not in like a not difficult way, because I'm sure that was very difficult to relive a lot of those moments, as I know it is for many of us writing memoir. But were those readily tangible there, or did it take some time to sit and really think through those days? What was the writing process like?
well, it's I guess depending on recently, um, the words came out less emotionally attached. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Early on, as I said, when I went um, through treatment through the psychologist, which the same psychologist I still see today, and she's really the only reason I'm perceivably as sane as I am. But honestly, I mean, there's so much that I have to say in a positive light that we need to have access to mental health care. And I've been very fortunate that I attached with someone who just got me finally. So in our therapies initially, um, she took me through some therapies that actually are given to war vets and things, and um, they involve a real immersive exposure sense, and a lot of it is vocally going there, and I couldn't do that. It was just horrible and traumatizing, and so she knew that my strength really was in writing, and that's where, as I started writing the detail, and then I would read that back to her in our sessions, and the simplest of things were just gut wrenching to tell. Like in the memoir or in the podcast, I tell pretty detailed stories of what happened. And to answer your question, yes, those have always, and weirdly, they've just always been there. Um, the difference is through therapy over the years, um, and just building myself, I find now, even revisiting statement that I had taken, the police had taken right immediately after I was rescued, as well as transcripts from the courts and things like that, and really hearing my words. It was fascinating how those words were in my mind already, but the difference is now the emotion isn't attached. Um, I still I still get I go there emotionally and to that sad place when I think of that girl and that 21-year-old that was forced to do all that was forced to live that. Um, so that's hard, and then that also attached to motherhood. But in terms of remembering the detail, it's weirdly always just been there. I mean, I can watch a movie and not remember the
Mhm.
that I saw, whatever recently or even not so much, but that experience and I don't know if I've really put a finger on why. But it maybe it was the counting um part of it or I don't know. It somehow it just it's pretty solid. And somebody also told
You're
that when you'd be surprised at what comes out when you think you can't remember something, start writing, and you'd be amazed at what comes out, and I can truly attest that that's very true. That's very true.
Yeah.
So
I've had that experience as well. And I just have to give you, kudos for just how immersive and engaging your writing is. I mean, you're speaking for the podcast, you're reading your story, but it's I just found myself like being able to visualize so much of what you were describing. You're so descriptive. And even when you were talking about, the little details, like you remembering how like painful your eyes were getting because you've had your contacts in for 3 days. Like that's such an amazing detail for communicating to the reader the passage of time and the impact that this is having, the like escalating impact, right? In just such a small way of like, here's my eyeball and it is hurting because it is dry and I still have these contacts in, but I'm fearful to say anything because I don't want this being taken away from me as well. It's just it's such a great way to encapsulate on a very tangible level. Again, something super relatable for anyone who wears contacts and you've left them in overnight accidentally or after a late night or whatever.
yeah.
Um, and just being able to like use that as just one little detail of the way that your whole body and system is continuing to deteriorate or become more aggravated by being in this environment and not having the proper, you know, hygiene, nutrition, etc. I just thought that was such a great detail to really like focus on and take a minute to really describe because of what it represents in a broader sense.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, I guess that's kind of where my brain goes um when and I'm not saying anything's wrong with true crime, but I think we just need to think about why we glorify these very disturbed, sick individuals. It's really the only thing we need to glorify is the fact that they are disturbed and sick. The detail in what they do and the fascination is, it sometimes can be a bit overblown. And I think in telling the story of how somebody who's surviving this, like the simple things in life, right? When we see a movie or, something that's depicting someone of this criminal mindset doing these things, we see just a lot of terror and fear. And we see, this high level, just almost just limited level, but intense level of emotion that this person is experiencing. But in a lot of ways, and that's a story that I feel is untold, the terror is in the moment by moment, in the simple things that you don't get anymore, like your ability to go to privacy when you're going to the washroom, the contact lens wearing. My long-term worry that wearing my contacts for what it was at 3, 4, 5 days in a row or something, what was that doing to my eyes? Um, the simple things like that. And just the how as humans, when we're in these situations, we're not necessarily sitting there just screaming in terror. Sometimes our survival is internal, and sometimes we just have to do things. Like for me, it was the counting. Like I counted. Like I don't know why I started counting, but I talk about that in the podcast, and that kept me grounded. Watching bugs crawl around, uh,
Right.
that
Getting acclimated to the bugs. You talked about how, like, early on, it was like torture. It was a different level of torture because they're always touching you and moving, and then you just, I don't know, there's this acceptance where you don't even like feel them, or you can just observe them as like a neutral third party almost, and showing that like kind of mental shift and the different things our brains do, right? When we're in those sort of situations to keep us more distanced from what we're experiencing in our bodies, right?
absolutely. And I think we can all, maybe that's relatable. That's the adaptability
Right.
piece and the compliance piece. And we do that in a lot of ways in our life. And we just, a lot of times we will look back and think, I can't believe I thought that that was normal. So I guess that's my intention in telling the story in this simple sort of way. Um, it wasn't it wasn't my choice to tell it this way. As I mentioned before, my podcast producer, his name is JJ Lee, and he took this on as something that he felt he had a vision for, and I trusted and followed because it just felt good to talk about it, to be honest. And I think that's really the messaging that I try to convey as much as possible, and is the power of owning your story and the power of telling your story. It doesn't have to be public. It can just be to yourself, but the power of addressing that in you is so strong. So that's
Mhm.
my experience, and it's been many years of looking at why and how to do that too. I always knew right from the get go. And it's funny looking back, and I'm lucky that I have my words documented because it was connected to a crime, right? It's like my form
Right.
of a journal. And I can look back at these statements, and then this one article that I wrote where I was mad at the media for, putting me in a light that I didn't feel was accurate. But it's like I was 21, 22, 23, and I was doing this, and I'm like, there she is. They still got that.
Your rage when he's reading the article and the article says that you have brown hair. Oh my gosh, it was so relatable. Again, like these little nuggets that you include that just like this human aspects where it's like we as outsiders can no longer convince ourselves that like, oh, well, this could never happen to me. I can be distanced from this. But like I would be outraged if I have been, missing and the description of me is garbage and the photo chosen is like not helpful. It's like I've seen some of these like memes or reels of like the followers of true crime like putting together their own like descriptions and photo for if they go missing, here's the folder that you give to people so they can actually find me. Again, like just I could so empathize with your frustration in that moment of like, this is supposed to be helping. How are you ever going to find me when you can't even get the description right?
I
So
know.
good. So good.
Well, and it saved my life too because he was so surprised that I was, I'm and that's another part of the story is showing, I guess, there is a human being in there somewhere, and whether that is something that is workable in all scenarios is not something I'm convinced to have any sort of expertise in. But in my situation, somehow appealing to his human sense and him seeing me as human, with everything else in the world of fate involved, it kept me alive. And I guess this is what I've got to work with. And this is the story really that almost killed me or made me really, really sick. And yeah, it just feels good to talk about it. So that's where it's at. And I want I want my daughter to, again, I blame her for my for my downfall, but she also saved my life. She made me realize how I wasn't coping healthily with this and forced me to deal with it. So I don't know. I mean, it's a way of looking at something from a different light, and I think, we're in a time where we have so many communication tools. So um, I'm adding a piece out
I
there.
love it. So, in these last few minutes of our episode, what is next for this story for season 2? Are you gonna do a season 2 of the podcast? What comes next?
Well, world domination is something to dream about. Um, I I just would like to see this kind of messaging uh, reverberate out there. And as we talked about in the very beginning, we're all saying the same thing. And whether it was something happened to us, an internal sense in a home, it was an uncle, it was, a family friend, whatever it was, trauma is trauma. And we're all saying the same thing. And the more that we can have relatable connections to the cores of these stories, I think the power that has power with it. So what's next for me is to tackle this in a few different ways. I have a business that it's a health tech company that would be a portal of resources that people can access, that is vetted, that are uh, really focused on post-traumatic growth. And I am passionate about being a voice in building that community. I want to write my memoir. That's next, in actually a written form, that would really go into more of the stories and um, the the stuff that you find in the podcast. But as we know, the movie version is never quite the same as the as the book version. So that's a channel. But yes, there is a season 2 and more planned for Stand Up 8, and that would fall in line with these community voices that I hear. And it's really looking at what does it mean to be a survivor today, and still going back to the impact of the crime, because it never leaves you. There isn't a day in my life that I don't think about that in some way, shape, or form. And I'm not like I sit down and dread it, but simple things. Every night before I go to bed, I check the locks at least 3 times. And I try to do 2. Well, I'm blind. I have to get up and do that 3rd one. They're always there. And it's okay.
Um,
That's okay. That's
yeah.
normal. They're usually always locked. So that's a good thing. Um, but yes, bringing in the community voices, and just having those relatable bits and showing that we're all moving. We all want to move forward, at least a good majority of us. And the more that we can interconnect, I think um, it'll spread out. I mean, there's a lot of a good um, to be spread, and unfortunately, mm, I don't want to play media as bad, but fear and fear mongering sells. So let's let's look at the voices that are the positive, with some of the nitty gritty in there, and let's tell some stories. So yeah, world
Yeah.
dominant.
You pose this question in one of your episodes, so I'm gonna leave this for the listeners to ponder, and the question you pose and then later, answer throughout your episode, and that I think we've answered throughout this conversation is the ability to tell a story a strength? So listener, I hope you'll take some time, think about that. Hop over to Lenore's podcast, Stand Up 8. We will have links to that in the show description. Again, it's captivating story. And I hope you'll follow along in Lenore's journey. Thank you, Lenore, for being here. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for opening our eyes to just a different perspective of looking at something in just a different way, right? And taking true crime and kind of flipping it on its head and providing just such keen insight. Um, yeah, in just a refreshing, needed way. So thank you again for being here today.
Thank you for reaching out. This is, yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's nice to meet you and nice to have, like-minded, synergy in what we're doing. So, yeah, thank you for what you do.
Absolutely. Please like, share, subscribe to the channel. Please give us a review on Apple Podcasts. We love to hear your feedback, and we'll see you again next week.